I've always been fascinated with the unused content found in Fire Emblem games. Most games in the series have a large number of unused characters, items, even music. Path of Radiance is no exception. In fact, it has quite a lot, so let's get right to it. But there are a couple of things I want to go over first. Number 1, the reason why I haven't done this video until I finish playing through the entirety of Radiant Dawn on my channel is that some of Path of Radiance's unused content hints at Radiant Dawn spoilers. For the sake of those who don't want to be spoiled, I'm going to leave my discussion of all of that until the end of this video, and don't worry, I will warn you when that moment is coming. Secondly, there's a concept that I'll have to go over before talking about the Path of Radiance unused content, and that is internal names. All characters, weapons, items, pieces of music, pretty much everything that can be referred to in the game's code has what's known as an internal name, the name that it's known by in the game's files. Internal names are the same in all languages, and are usually based off of the Japanese names. Why I'm going over this now is there are some pieces of unused content that were so unfinished, the only evidence of their existence is their internal name. Also, there are some items, like Ike's Regal Sword, that do exist in the finished game, but have unusual internal names that suggest they were something else earlier in development. And while we're on the subject of internal names, Path of Radiance started development before Sacred Stones, but was finished after that game came out. As a result, Path of Radiance refers to itself as Fire Emblem 8 internally. And so does Sacred Stones. So, fun fact, there is no Fire Emblem game that is referred to in its coding as Fire Emblem 9. With that all out of the way, let's start our discussion of the game's unused content, starting with what I feel is the most interesting, unused characters. Path of Radiance has many NPCs who never make an appearance on the battlefield, but who the game does have full base stats and in some cases growth rates for. The first of these is Ike's father Grail. Now, Grail appeared as the boss of the prologue in heavily weakened form, but what would Grail's stats look like if he wasn't holding back? Well, they'd look something like this. Yeah, I'd say those stats for a level 10 hero definitely fit his reputation in the story. He also hilariously has an 80% skill growth despite starting with that stat already capped. This Grail is usually referred to as Grail Strong version, and an interesting bit of trivia is that Ike and Titania have bond support with this version of Grail, but not the prologue version of Grail. So you'll never see those bond supports in effect without hacking. Now, if you're very knowledgeable about Path of Radiance, you might notice that Grail's caps are exactly the same as the caps for Ike's promoted class. Ike's promotion is basically Hero, just without the ability to use axes. Right down to having the same personal skill, in fact. If you hack an occult scroll onto him, Grail can learn Ether, and the skill is mostly functional for him. The animation will just be split between the Soul and Lunar portions. But for all intents and purposes, the skill works the way that it's supposed to. Since Grail appears to be the most complete of the game's unused characters, many people suspect that he was originally going to be a trial map character. Which would have been pretty cool, though with the sheer number of playthroughs you already need to unlock Ashnard, I doubt many people would have seen Grail anyway, even if he was included as a trial map character. Next up, we have a much less complete character, Sephiroth. As you can see, he has no growth rates, and he has base stats listed, but these are not the base stats that he uses for his NPC appearance in Chapter 10 for some reason. Also, no, I did not make a mistake with his resistance. It is actually 1 point higher than the Bishop cap. I'm not sure why that's the case, but he's not the only unused character to have this issue. He does at least still have Mantle though, and Mantle does make you completely invincible in Path of Radiance, though it lacks any of the additional effects it would have in Radiant Dawn. Following Sephiroth, we have Zelgius, and yeah, like Sephiroth, Zelgius has a lot of cap-breaking stats. I guess he had Limit Breaker before it was cool. Also, he still has growth rates despite being level 20, and Sephiroth was level 1 and didn't have growth rates. Not sure where the logic is there. Anyway, Celsius' stats are suitably impressive for a general, but given how many of his stats exceed their caps, I don't think he was ever intended to appear as an NPC, or as a trial map character. I think his stats mostly exist for completeness. Speaking of characters whose stats mainly exist for completeness and probably were never intended to appear on the battlefield, Segun. So Segun's base stats are pretty low for the level that she's been assigned, and she has no growth rates. But what's even worse about Segun is that she has no map model for using lances, and that includes even equipping them. So, having her equip a lance will crash the game, despite the fact that she starts with an S rank in lances. Many people wondered whether Segun was intended to be a playable character in Path of Radiance, because she has a unique name and portrait and plays a pretty prominent role in the story, but I don't think this is the case. Personally, I only think Segun's stats exist for the sake of her appearance on the map in Chapter 13. Considering how incomplete she is, by the way, if you do have her fight, she'll just use a generic Falcon Knight model. Yeah, I don't think she was ever intended to be playable. But she was in Radiant Dawn at least, and her affinity in that game matches her affinity here. Next up, we have some base stats and growth rates for Lekhain and Hetzel. Now, the reason why I've lumped these two together is they have the same growths and bases. And weapon ranks. In fact, the only thing that's different about these two is their affinities, and their affinities are not the same as the ones they would end up having in Radiant Dawn. Also, Oliver has unused base stats and growth rates that are identical to these two, but I don't consider him an unused character because he does appear as a trial map unit. As for these two, not much else to say. I feel they're a lot like Segun. They were never intended to appear on the map as NPCs at all, and their stats mostly exist for completeness. And now we come to one of the most enigmatic unused characters in this game, Heather. Now I know what you're all thinking, there's a playable character in Radiant Dawn named Heather, but I highly doubt this Heather has anything to do with that one. This one is an unpromoted female sword knight. She has light affinity, a D rank in swords, but also a C rank in lances despite being unable to use them, and her own unique set of base stats and growth rates. She seems to be very unfinished though, because she uses the Bednion crest as her face sprite. Whether she's an early concept for Astrid, or if they plan to have another knight join you during the Bednion arc, I'm not sure. And then we have the very bizarrely named Melty. Melty has the exact same growth rates and base stats as Heather. The slight difference in base stats I have listed here is because Pegasus Knight has different base stats than Sword Knight. The way base stats are stored in the game's data, I haven't actually gone over this before, is that the character has a set of additions that are added to the class's base stats. Melty's are identical to Heather's. Essentially, Melty is a clone of Heather, but as a Pegasus Knight. Now, the strange thing about Melty is that she's not entirely unused. Melty's growths and base stats are used for Tanith's Pegasus Knight reinforcements. Because of this, I don't feel like Melty is an unused concept for a playable character, more that this is just where the game stores the base stats and growths of Tanith's reinforcements. Now we come to the Lagoo's unused characters, starting with Kanagas. For such a prominent character in Path of Radiance's story, you'd expect you'd be able to see him fight, but sadly he just sends Gifka in his place in endgame. But speaking of Gifka, Kanagas' stats are very similar to his, only differing by 1 or 2 points in a few stats. His growths are also very similar. Kanagas' Earth affinity matches the affinity he'd later be given in Radiant Dawn. Next we have Nieluchi. He shows up on the map in a few chapters, but we never get to see him in battle. Nieluchi is a level 10 Raven with some pretty average base stats all round, and not that great growths. There's a lot of evidence suggesting Nieluchi may have been playable at one point in development, but I'll get to that in the unused dialogue section. I always found it strange that this guy never joined in Path of Radiance, because you never recruited a non-royal Raven. Sadly, we'd have to wait until Radiant Dawn for him to make a playable appearance, though in that game he had fire affinity rather than light. Finally, we have Leanne. She has a full set of base stats and growth rates in the game's code, and some of her bases are higher than her brother's. Unfortunately, she has no skills programmed in, so if you hack her into the game, she's pretty useless unless you also hack Kanto onto her. Speaking of useless, yes, you are reading that right, she does get a 10% critical bond support from Rayson, despite the fact that Heron's crit rates are useless because they can't fight. Like Nieluchi, there is evidence that more was planned to be done with Leanne in the game, but that it was ultimately scrapped. However, unlike Neolucci, Leanne's base stats are not exactly unused. She appears as an NPC in parts 3 and 4 of chapter 17. Now, you normally can't look at her stats because Ike spends the whole chapter carrying her, but once Tibbard and company show up as NPCs in part 4, you can cycle through their stats to get a view of Leanne's stat screens. And yes, her stats there definitely match the ones that are listed in the game's code. It's a cool detail about this game that I don't think a lot of people know about. One final thing, like Neolucci, when Leanne showed up as a full playable character in Radiant Dawn, she had a different affinity, in this case water instead of wind. So, how about that evidence that Leanne and Neolucci may have been playable characters at one point? For that, we'll have to go into unused dialogue. Before I start this section, I'll mention that all of this dialogue only exists in the Japanese version. The localizers seem to have realized that these lines were unused, and as such, deleted them from the game. So I'm going off of the Cutting Room Floor's translations for these. Leanne and Neolucci have unused death quotes, or rather retreat quotes since neither of them actually die if defeated, in the game's code. They also have unused escape quotes. No other unused character has these, so it's likely these two may have been playable at some point, or at least NPCs during an escape mission. Speaking of escape missions, Chapter 10 is in fact the last escape mission in the game. Because of this, any character who joins after Chapter 10, you'll never get a chance to see their escape quotes, but in the Japanese version, every character does have an escape quote in the game's code. So thanks to the Cutting Room Floor, here's a translation of the escape quotes of all characters who join after Chapter 10. The next piece of unused dialogue is something that a lot of you might find more interesting. Unused support conversations. Now, before you get your hopes up, no dialogue exists for these conversations. All we have is empty script files that hint that a lot more supports were planned to be in the game. But as all these files are empty, I'm guessing they were cut quite early into development. So here's a list of all the supports that could have been, in order that the characters joined. Ike and Zhark. This one is a little bit more interesting than the others, but I'll get to that later. It also would have given Ike 2 potential Earth supports, so that would have been a pretty big boost to his evasion. Boyd and Devdon, Oscar and Astrid, Shinnon and Mist, Gatry and Bastion, Marsha and Mia, Mist and Tormod, Mist and Volk, which would have probably been pretty interesting. I'm guessing their A support could only happen after Chapter 19, where Volk reveals his true mission, and his true relation with their father. Kieran and Leth, Brom and Joffrey, Brom and Makalov, Nephany and Mia, Astrid and Tanith, Stefan and Toroniu, Morim and Stefan, another one that could have been really interesting, but sadly it was not to be, Devdon and Makalov, which probably would have been hilarious, Rayson and Ulki, Janeth and Rayson, why these aren't supports in the final game I have no idea, Tanith and Volk, Khalil and Shinnon, Ranulf and Toroniu, Har and Soph, Har and Ulki, Lucia and Titania, Joffrey and Kieran, Joffrey and Bastion, like the Rayson support. Why the heck were these cuts? It makes perfect sense for Joffrey to have supports for those two, but for some reason he doesn't. Elincia and Jill, which would have been amazing. Elincia and Lucia, Elincia and Morim, Elincia and Nephany, funnily enough I actually have those two supported in Heroes, and finally Elincia and Toroniu. Volk and Elincia definitely suffered the most from these cut supports. Volk only has one support in the final game with Bastion, and Elincia originally had a lot more. Thing is, I kind of feel like they had the right idea here. Elincia joins a few chapters before the end of the game. If she had that many supports, it would have taken a lot of playthroughs to see all of them. As I said earlier, no dialogue exists for any of these supports, only the empty script files. So, I guess, go nuts fanfiction writers. But there's one exception to the no dialogue rule, and that's Ike's support with Zhark. So, in the epilogue, whichever character has an A support with Ike gets a slightly modified line when addressing him. Zhark's support with Ike may have been cut, but Zehark's alternate A support dialogue with Ike in the epilogue still exists in the game, and it was officially localized too. This is the one leftover from the unused support in the game's dialogue. This isn't exactly unused dialogue, but before we move on from this section, something to cover. There are a few unused name tags in the game's coding. I think these are used to call characters' names during dialogue. These have both internal names and Japanese names. The first is Sanaki_Black, or Black Sanaki. I have no idea what this would have been used for, or what even this was referencing. This name is listed below regular Sanaki. We also have two alternate Sephiron names, Sephiron 2 and Good Sephiron, which has the internal name Sephiron_Fake. Maybe Sephiron was gonna have a body double in an early draft of the story. We also have a duplicate name for the Black Knight, and it's called Black Knight when his normal internal name is Dark Knight. Monica, who's listed between Largo and Astrid, no idea who that would have been, but probably just a random NPC. Some very weirdly spelled internal names for a couple of the early game pirates, and Gleiss, whose name is listed in the middle of the late game bosses, so presumably this guy was another generic boss. Next up, unused items, and Path of Radiance has quite a few of these, most of which are fully functional. These include Irvan, Grail's iconic axe, Rex Flame, and Rex Caliber. You never get the S-ranked weapons for axes, fire, or wind in the final game, but they're fully functional if you hack them in. The spells even have complete battle animations. I'm not really sure why they cut any of these, maybe they just couldn't think of a good time to give them to you in the game. There's also the Bright Bow. Now, swords, axes, and lances all had magical equivalents, and it only makes sense that the bow equivalent of a magic weapon will be light, seeing as both bows and light magic exist outside the weapon triangle in this game. The most unique thing about the Bright Bow is it has 1 to 2 range. If this is starting to sound familiar to you, this unused weapon was probably the inspiration for the Shining Bow in Fire Emblem Fates. This one is fully functional if hacked into the game, but the final weapon I'm going to cover here is not really. The Devil Axe. This one has full stats coded and an actual description, and it works with map animations, but it doesn't have a battle model, so if you try and have a character attack with it with animations turned on, this happens. Both the Bright Bow and Devil Axe have concept art in the game's art book, so it's likely they were cut late into development. Now to some unused staves, and these are much more unfinished. They don't have proper names, they're just called IDD_Berserk, Warp, and Unlock. The Warp and Unlock staves appear to work normally if they're hacked in, Berserk has a range of 1 to magic over 2, and I think it does give weapon experience, but it doesn't have any effect when you use it. I'm sure a lot of Fire Emblem players are breathing a sigh of relief knowing that this weapon was left on the cutting room floor. Fun fact, the unused Berserk staff in this game is, to the date of this video, the last time that item ever appeared in the series. There are also a couple of unused items. A Laguz stone that has the same function as the normal one, but is coloured blue and has 1 less use. And then there's the Silver Card, an item that appeared in Radiant Dawn and in many other Fire Emblem games. Now, I have no idea why this item was cut, because it's fully functional if hacked into the game, and has a description in all languages. The rest of the unused items are just skill scrolls. Now, I'm pretty sure these only exist for the purpose of completeness. I believe with all of these skill scrolls, every non-mastery skill in the game has its own associated scroll. But I highly doubt you were able to obtain most of these. For example, the Paragon scroll is only usable by Astrid and Joffrey, both of whom already start with the skill. I wonder if this was an indicator that Radiant Dawn's remove a skill and it turns into a scroll mechanic was planned to be in this game. There is one outlier here, the Impregnable scroll. I'll be talking about that later when I cover unused skills. It only being usable by Astrid and Joffrey probably means it was copy-pasted from Paragon's data. While we're on the subject, a bit of trivia about Tanith's reinforcement skill. Even though it has a scroll that you can hack into the game, the reinforced skill is coded to only work on maps from chapter 18 and on. In other words, from when Tanith joins and onward. So any earlier in the game, this skill does nothing. Another weird bit of trivia about these skills, the Chant scroll is programmed to only work on transformed herons, but as Laguz can't transform at the base, which is the only place you can assign skills, it's completely useless. The Vigilance scroll also has some strange behaviour, though I'm going to leave talking about that for the Radiant Dawn spoilers section. For now though, I'll just say that I love how its internal name is just Big Ear. Those are the unused items that still have item data left over, but some items weren't so lucky. These unused items have only their internal names remaining in the game's data. The first is the Rapier. A very early screenshot shows Ike using one, but they eventually decided to give him a unique weapon with a similar effect, instead of just the series standard rapier. Here's where an interesting thing about internal names comes into play. Ike's Regal Sword, which is for all intents and purposes a rapier, has the internal name Longsword. This is because in a very early build of the game, that was the name of Ike's personal weapon. The actual longsword from the final game has the internal name Horse Killer. Speaking of which, there's a weapon with the internal name Dragon Killer, which was obviously meant to be a Worm Slayer. There's also evidence the Dragon Axe was planned to be in the game. As for the Lance counterpart, the Dragon Spear, that internal name is attached to a weapon that is used in the final game, the Laguz Lance. And that leads to a few more internal naming oddities. The Laguz Slayer, the sword Laguz slaying weapon, is known internally as Rancebuster, which is probably supposed to be Lancebuster, while the Laguz Axe is known internally as Swordbuster. These come from the names of the Reaver weapons from the GBA Fire Emblem games, the ones that reverse the weapon triangle, implying that Reaver weapons were planned to appear in this game at some point. Back to the unused internal names, there's Lightning Sword, which is called Light Sword in Japanese, which probably ended up becoming the Rune Sword. Hauteclair, now this one is interesting. You might remember Hauteclair as being Minerva's axe from Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, but this appearance predates that. There's no data for it besides the name, but it was not intended to be an axe in Path of Radiance, but rather a sword, as this internal name appears in the list of the game's swords. Also in that list is Fire Emblem. Not sure if that was planned to be a sword or not. Ashnard Only Sword. There's also a Shining Bow internal name, which is actually called Sonic Bow in Japanese. Presumably there was going to be a second magical bow, but both of them got cut. And here's something interesting. Tiger Fang, Lion Fang, and Cat Fang, as well as Crow Talon, Hawk Talon, and Black Breath. This implies that beast tribes were originally meant to use fangs, and bird tribes were originally meant to use talons as their weapons. In Radiant Dawn, hawks, tigers, and lions would get fangs and talons instead of beaks and claws. Black Breath implies the existence of a Black Dragon class. More on that later, but for now I'll just mention, this is just an internal name. There's no data for the weapon itself. Finally in the list of unused internal names are Robber's Key, which is probably a lockpick, Member Card, which seems to have a description in Japanese but was never used in the final game, and Mine from the GBA games. Next on our list is unused classes. Firstly, you only get to see female bow knights in the final game due to Astrid, but the game still has stats for female sword, lance, and axe knights. These are all pretty standard stuff and mostly identical to the male versions of these classes. The game also has unused data for element-locked mages, both male and female versions of fire, thunder, and wind mages and sages. This would later be used in Radiant Dawn. In Path of Radiance's final version, all mages and sages could use all three types of anima magic. In the final version, Volk is the only assassin you see in the game, but there is data for generic assassins. If you hack Soft to be able to promote, this is the model that he'll use. There's also data for a female assassin class, though some of its stats are very weird, and there is no corresponding female thief class, so I don't know what this would end up being used for. Last, and most interestingly, of the Bjork unused classes is Female Bishop. Female Bishop is actually what the game uses as a placeholder class for characters who appear on the map but never in battle. The main one who uses this class is Alincia, and as a result, if hacked into the game, its battle model is heavily based on unarmored Alincia. It's a fully functional class if hacked into the game though, having its own set of unique battle animations. Besides Alincia, Sanaki and, hilariously enough, Gareth also use this class when they appear in cutscenes. So Alincia and Sanaki are the two most commonly hacked into this class to show it off. Weird thing about Alincia though, she suffers from the opposite problem that a lot of unused Fire Emblem classes do. Namely, she has fully functioning battle models, but her map model has no animations for anything other than walking, so if you try to have her fight with battle animations turned off, the game will crash. Sanaki has no such problem though. Her map model has a shoving animation, which also works for casting spells and using staves. Speaking of Sanaki though, there are some unused map models for an older looking Sanaki, and these models do have a proper map animation for casting magic. Interestingly, the art book has concept art of this adult version of Sanaki, so if you ever wanted to see what Sanaki would look like as an adult, here you go. Presumably Sanaki was originally envisioned as an older character, but they decided to make her a child because they thought that'd work better with both the story and humour. That's all for the Bjork, but there are two unused Laguz classes in the game. The first is Generic Herons. These have full base stats and class growths coded into the game, and they even have map models as well. The art book also has concept art of Generic Herons. They're referred to internally as bird_HE in their unshifted form, and heron in their shifted form, whereas Raisin and Leanne's version of the class is referred to as bird HEW and heron W, i.e. heron white. It's a plot point in the Bednion arc that only royal herons had white wings. Now, despite having fully working map models, the same can't be said for the generic heron battle models. Yeah, this is clearly unfinished. Now, some of the art book info on the game's story mentions that at one point in development, there were supposed to be over 100 survivors of the Serenades massacre instead of just Raisin's family. Presumably, these generic herons were a leftover from that earlier draft of the story. In the final version, no non-royal herons survived the massacre, so there was no need for this class. The next unused class is Black Dragon, which unfortunately is very, very unfinished. Kurthnaga kinda got the short end of the stick in both games. It has its own map model for its unshifted state, and it has a fully functioning transform gauge, but upon transforming, it still keeps its untransformed map model, and its class name is just JID_Black Dragon. This class does have transform bonuses, base stats, and class growths coded into the game. However, remember I mentioned before that the Black Breath weapon only exists as an internal name and nothing more? Yeah, there's no Black Breath weapon coded into the game, so Black Dragons can't actually do anything in transformed form. While on the subject of unused classes, here are a few more battle models that technically exist in the game, you just never get to see them. The first is Leanne. Her battle model is a little glitchy sometimes, but it works mostly fine. You'll never see this in the final game, because every time Leanne appears as an NPC, Ike is carrying her. Next is the map model for generic untransformed red dragons. This one's fully functional, you'll just never see it because every generic red dragon you fight in the game is a feral one and thus never untransforms. While we're on the subject of map models that exist in the game but you'll never get to see them without hacking, the Black Knight does have a very cool looking map model for using lances, from unused classes to unused skills. Most of these have no data besides their internal name. Some of these still take up capacity but don't actually do anything. By far the most complete unused skill, though that isn't saying much, is Impregnable, otherwise known as Iron Wall. This is the only unused skill with an icon, and the only one with a corresponding skill scroll. The fact that it does have its own skill scroll implies that it was not a mastery skill. But since it's not coded to do anything, and its help text doesn't really help much, we have no idea what this skill would have done. Its icon looks a lot like Pervise from some of the later games, but we know this isn't Pervise because there's data for that skill in the game too. I'll get to that later. Next we have some even more unfinished skills. Bargain, a skill taken directly from Fire Emblem 4, actually does do what it's supposed to if hacked onto a character. Unlike the FE4 version of the skill, as long as one character has this skill equipped, shop prices are halved for everyone. Among other skills that names imply their effects are Single Combat, which some people suspect may have been the charge skill from Genealogy, and Evil Eye. This one later showed up in Radiant Dawn as Nyla's personal skill, localized as Glare. But then we have some even stranger unused skill names. Big Magic, which is called internally W level up to S, implying that it would let characters reach an S rank in their weapon types, except this function is handled by a different skill in the final game, SID_higher. So no idea why this one exists. There's also Flight, which is not the same as the invisible skill SID_fly, which turns a character into a flyer, and Breakthrough, which also doesn't have any effects. Equip Beast, which presumably was used to handle characters being able to equip Legu's weapons. However, Legu's have access to these weapons by default, so there's no reason for this to exist, and it doesn't even do anything anyway. There's also Chaos. This has no effect, but I'm guessing this was intended to be a personal skill for Ashnard's Berserk form. What it would have done, I have no idea, but it being the chaotic counterpart to Mantle would make a lot of sense. Then there's Absolute Move, which, judging by its name, would probably allow a unit to cross any terrain with a movement cost of 1, but it doesn't actually do anything and was never used in the final version. There's also a large list of alternate chant skills. Song of HP, Song of Strength, etc. There's a song for every stance. This implies that Herons were able to learn chants other than the one that let units move again. This seems to be similar to the Dancer Rings from Blazing Sword, which would allow a character to dance or sing for another and give them a buff to one of their stats. Radiant Dawn would later introduce chants other than the Move Again one, but none that increase stats. Then there's a skill Pacifist, which causes the user to not attack when entering battle. You can still initiate combat, but you won't actually do anything. Now, I'm not entirely sure about this, but I feel like this skill was not intended to be used in gameplay, but rather to create cutscenes. Specifically, in Chapter 24, Ike fights the Black Knight in a scripted battle. Ike attacks twice, but the Black Knight never counterattacks. Perhaps the Black Knight is assigned the Pacifist skill in this scene just for the sake of creating a scripted battle. That's all the unused skills that have text associated with them, but there's some unused, can you believe it, sound effects that imply the existence of a few more scrap skills. In Path of Radiance, every class's mastery skill has its own unique activation flash and sound effects. In the final game, Wyvern Lords share the stun skill with Pegasus Knights, and Generals share the Lunar skill with Soldiers. However, there are some unused flashes and sound effects that can be viewed in the game's battle model viewer that imply that Wyvern Riders and Generals would get their own unique mastery skills. Now, the Wyvern Rider one is just called Mastery for Wyverns, so we have no idea what that one was going to be. But the one for Generals is called Mastery Pervise, or Mastery Great Shield. Now, this one doesn't have an unused flash, but there is an unused sound effect for a mastery skill unique to Bishops. In the final game, they share the Flare mastery skill with Sages. One final detail regarding these sound effects is not the one that's unused, but this is another internal name case. The sound effect the game uses for the mastery skill of Warriors and Berserkers, Colossus, is called Sound Effects Battle Special Anger 1, and the battle model previewer calls it Mastery Wrath, which seems to imply that the Wrath skill was initially meant to be the mastery skill of Warriors and Berserkers before it became a generic skill. Which might explain why the Colossus skill sucks so much. It was probably thrown together at the last minute. While on the subject of unused sound effects, I should probably cover unused music. Sadly, there isn't very much in this game. Don't worry though, Radiant Dawn has far more. Path of Radiance only has 2 unused songs. The first is an unused comical theme. really sure where that one would have played. The next is an alternate game over theme. Anyone who's played the sequel should be very, very well acquainted with that song. Yeah, they just reused the unused Game Over theme from Path of Radiance as Radiant Dawn's actual Game Over theme. So really, we only got one unused piece of music out of this game. However, the debug menu lists the names of a few songs that don't exist in the final version, and these names imply some interesting things about the game. The first is references to battle themes for Bertram, Ina, Petrine, and Magic 1. In the final game, all three of those characters just use the generic powerful boss theme, A Mighty Foe. But it is interesting that the three of them were planned to get their own unique battle themes at some points. What's also interesting is how Ina is listed here, and Bertram and Petrine are both members of the Four Riders. The Black Knight obviously already had his own battle theme. So this would imply that Ina was originally the fourth member of the Four Riders and not Bryce. In fact, Bryce being a very late development addition to the Four Riders makes a lot of sense. He's the only one of the four not to have official art, and he only appears on the battlefield in the final chapter, and fighting him is completely optional. No idea what the Magic 1 battle theme would have been used for though. Other references to non-existent music include Opening 1, Opening 2, and Opening_show. This implies the title screen originally had music on it, and Opening Show is the same kind of file name used for the music for class roles in earlier Fire Emblems, implying that this game was meant to have its own class role, much like Radiant Dawn did. There's also some unused event themes. Event Father 1, Event Joy 1, Event Astarte 1, which is the Japanese name of Ashura, and Event Sephiron 1. Interestingly, the internal name here spells Sephiron with an S like it is in the English version, not with a C. Then there's Pro 00, Pro 04, 05, and 06. Apparently these file names refer to unused songs for map narration sequences. And now something also interesting. BGM Colosseum Battle 1, Colosseum FF1, and Colosseum Info 1. The names of these songs imply that an arena was planned to be in this game at some point. The 25th anniversary Making of Fire Emblem book would later reveal that they did plan to add the arena as a feature of this game's base. In fact, the base was planned to be fully customizable and fully traversable in 3D. This feature would later on be used for real in Fire Emblem Fates as the My Castle system. One final thing to bring up, and I might as well bring this up before I go into Unused Portraits because that's going to segue into the Radiant Dawn spoilers. This isn't technically unused, and by now a lot of people know about this, but Fire Emblem Path of Radiance has one of the biggest gameplay omissions of any Fire Emblem localization, and that is that the non-Japanese versions of this game completely removed an entire difficulty setting. The English version's 3 difficulty modes are easy, normal, and hard, but in the Japanese version it was normal, hard, and maniac. Non-Japanese versions of the game removed maniac and replaced it with a new easy mode. Now, easy mode is mostly the same as normal, except that enemies give a lot more experience. There's one weird glitch in easy mode that I've heard reported a bit online, but I've never tested myself. Apparently certain late game enemies on easy mode, particularly red dragon feral ones, are bugged and have maniac mode stats. By that point though, you're probably strong enough to handle those kind of stats on just 1 or 2 enemies. But on to what Maniac Mode actually is. You get less experience from battle, all bonus experience is halved, much like Radiant Dawn's hard mode. There are a lot more enemies in every map, and starting from Chapter 18, every enemy is promoted. Now from what footage I've seen of this via hacks, we aren't missing out on very much. The majority of people who've played Maniac say it's much more frustrating than actually fun. And its difficulty, in giant air quotes, mostly comes from just spamming a ton of very durable enemies, so it's more tedious than anything else. Speaking of Japanese exclusive content though, you may know that Path of Radiance has a GBA link-up feature, which unlocks art galleries for Blazing Sword and Sacred Stones, as well as unlocking 3 additional trial maps. Now in the Japanese version you could also connect to Binding Blade to unlock its art gallery and one of those 3 bonus trial maps. Obviously, since Binding Blade was never released outside Japan, this link-up feature was cut from the English version. The trial map Desperation, which normally was unlocked by linking with Binding Blade, now requires linking with either Blazing Sword or Sacred Stones. All the files for the Binding Blade art gallery, however, still exist on the disc of the English version, you just can't access them without hacking. And one final thing while we're on the subject of region exclusives, there's a very bizarre glitch that, from what I've seen in research, only occurs in the North American version. Not in the Japanese version, and not in the European version. If you skip Chapter 1's village visiting tutorial, Ike will start out with 4 iron swords in his inventory instead of just 1. I'm not sure why this happens, and the fact that it's exclusive to the American version confuses me even more, but it's a very strange glitch in this game that can be pretty helpful if you have that version. Last on this list, because most of it isn't that interesting, is unused graphics. Apart from just the normal dummy portrait that you find in the data of most Fire Emblem games, there's an alternate portrait of Ike facing towards the camera, an alternate Soren portrait that has his hood up, which is kind of interesting. You can see on Soren's final portrait he very obviously has a hood on his cloak, but interesting to see that he was planned to raise the hood at some point in development. There's a slightly different variation of Anna's portrait, a couple of generic thieves, a placeholder icon for Merlinus's tent from FE7, all of the weapons and items from Thracia 776, though these were probably placeholders while the actual weapon sprites were being worked on, early versions of the player phase, enemy phase, and game over graphics, as well as one saying to be continued. There's an image of Leran's medallion with the text to be continued over it. Now, interesting thing about this image is that it only exists in the English version. Some people suspect that it was meant for a demo release that never came to be. There's also an alternate version of the title screen graphic for the English version that resembles its Japanese version much more closely. There's one final unused portrait though, and I can't go into this one without revealing Radiant Dawn spoilers, so now is the spoiler warning. Stop watching the video now if you don't want Radiant Dawn spoilers. If you are stopping now, thanks for watching. But if you're still here, there's an unused portrait of Renning in the game's code. We never get to see Renning personally in the game. However, if you overlay Bertram's portrait with this one and make it a little bit transparent, you'll notice that, yep, they pretty obviously knew at this point in development that Bertram and Renning were the same person. This was actually how many people figured this out before Radiant Dawn was released. Now, as for more Radiant Dawn spoilers in terms of secret identities, you might have noticed Zelgius's unused stats earlier in the video. Now, while his base stats and class are different, he does have the exact same affinity, growth rates, and weapon ranks as the Black Knights. And as if it wasn't any more obvious, the Black Knight's battle theme's internal name is BGM BTL Zelgius 1. Yep, real subtle game, real subtle. Onto that thing with the Vigilance scroll that I was mentioning earlier. Really weird thing about this scroll is that it works on Ulki as expected, but in the Japanese version it also works on Sephiron. Whether this was a mistake or a deliberate hint at Sephiron's true nature as a bird tribe Lagoos, I'm not sure. But whatever it is, this ability was removed from the English version and the scroll only works on Ulki. And speaking of Sephiron, all of those plot points about the goddesses in Radiant Dawn were definitely planned ever since this game, because among this game's list of unused name strings is Yune. And not just Yune, but Ashunara as well, the combined form of the goddesses. Or at least her Japanese name, Astarte-Yun. It's interesting to see that the developers did take into account plot points for the sequel when they programmed this game, but it did result in spoilers for Radiant Dawn getting out far earlier than they should have thanks to hackers cracking open this game. And that is pretty much all regarding Path of Radiance's unused content. Join me next time for a look at the unused content of Radiant Dawn.
That one has less in terms of unused characters and skills, but it has a ton more unused music, so look forward to that.